Hello, all. And now, the next topic I really want to discuss with you all is with regards to Plato's views on God and really his cosmological picture. Now, one of the rewarding things about Plato, and perhaps what also makes him so intimidating, is that since we can overlap conversations like his epistemology, his what he considers to be the good life, as we'll demonstrate in this video, and also his cosmological picture. So once you grasp with things like the forms and sort of the scheme that he has really developed as he matures through his writings, and I think this is best done with seeing how becoming is change, or the world of particulars. Being is what is considered unchanging, the eternal, or the realm of the forms. And then specifically now with regards to how he sees the cosmos, you also have the third, which is non-being, which is nothing in particular. And it is a sort of polarity against particulars, because since it is nothing, it can't have any sort of particularness. But this begs the question of, how do particulars come about? And so with Plato here, he's not talking really of a God that we would see with ex nihilo creation. There was nothing and then something happened. We see more of an organizer. We see that sort of view of divinity, unlike with perhaps Christian doctrine. But what is this non-being now? And for a particular, it has to have participation in the realm of the forms, in the realm of ideas or being. And the participation in the nature of a quality or some entity, an ideal, or something like an animal species, it has a sort of relationship as it participates in the nature of a being, or a form in this case. So form, through this act of participation, gives particularities to things in the world. Whereas with nothing, of course, since there's nothing in particular to it, it has no real relationship with being, because there can't be anything particularly induced out of nothing. Now, we get kind of swept up in some of the ambiguity with regards to Plato, because it's not necessarily clear how he views nothingness. And, since we're discussing this text after the scientific revolution, there is perhaps a reading that is rather popular to see that, what are the material conditions that are required in order to ever have anything in particular. What is the primal condition where particularities of certain kinds are created or formed, and what's that relationship like? What does it look like? We want to delve into that particular relationship, then we must turn to the topic of the divine to bring attention to what is the unchanging forms, or being in this case. Now, Plato, of course, talks about these, many different kinds of forms. Forms are the real in that sense that they contain being within them. So they transcend the world of particular things to the other realm of the ideas, of the ideal. These ideals represents the ideal good for that particular thing the form is representing. I guess an analogy would be to, think of when we have an idea of, vegetation or some sort of flower. We don't think of the withering, dying root, if you will. We think of a thriving blossom. That's the ideal, and how that relationship with a particular plant, or its particular state, is what we're really talking about here with the ideal of the good, of the idealization of what that particular thing is participating in. So, what is the relationship of these different forms, though? Since there's so many of them, what are they to each other? And with that, we have to ask what the cosmological organization would be like. What, unifies all of these forms, and in this case, goodness, together. The form of the formness, the ideal of the idealness, will then come to play here. Because to be a form is to be good, or the ideal, then the form of the good in its actuality as a whole. Form of the good is brought up in the Republic. This is the start, really, of where we can trace how, what is the form of the good going towards his cosmological picture of this supreme being that obviously has to represent some sort of goodness to the world. So, in this sense, Plato, with his theory of the forms, has somewhat stumbled onto developing a sort of theism of the forms. And we can see Plato has a direction here to not just a deity and an architect, but one that is measured toward creating good things. And in the Republic, when he talks about the good, and what gives the truth to the forms or the objects of knowledge. So what makes that possibility for us to be able to, ascend to the light of day, really? What makes it possible for us to know knowledge and form, to then be able to know the good? As the adage or the allegory goes, the prisoner is stuck in the shadows, but he is able to still see knowledge through the light of day. And when the prisoner releases himself, he climbs up the hill to get the greatest view of the sun. And the sun then represents the source that will give you the clear vision, not just of the bodily eyes, but the one of the soul, the eye of the mind, that true knowledge is. So knowledge and truth is like the good, but the sun ultimately is the source. Knowledge and truth are sort of almost like tools towards being orientated toward the good itself, but beyond that is with regards to beauty, above what even knowledge and truth, which are of course very important to Plato's philosophy. It is beauty, though, that guides us towards our attainment of wisdom and knowledge. It's a sort of driver, if you will. The sun, in the allegory, it gives visibility, but it also generates growth and nurture. And the objects of knowledge receives presence of that goodness, of that source, to then be known, but their essence is, of course, derived from that. The good is the source of knowledge and source of existence of forms, the source of the nature of how things are. The source then, and it's important to point out that this isn't not necessarily a sort of linear of this is the beginning, the source is where everything begins at, but it is the relationship of that dependence of the necessity of the sun, really, to sustain itself. Ongoing in this relationship, their being then is from that relationship to the good. So there isn't like this entry point of at the source, this is the very beginning. It's more about demonstrating that relationship in regards to how far one can go and go about in a journey towards goodness and the source, really. Because as it's been pointed out, if these forms are truly eternal, then Plato, why would he be able to commit to an origin point? Time doesn't factor into his theory of forms then, so we can't really have a sort of origin point. Now, turning to a more specific text, we want to look at the dialogue on Parmenides. And of course, this is a important discussion of discussing the one and how it's different than the many. The God then, of course, is the one, where particulars or changes, becoming, if you will, is the many. So there is one form of the good and appeal to many, of course, with theistic implications here towards things like the Abrahamic traditions. The one being of significance is, of course, vital to see with early Jewish and Christian thinking. Now, there is a notion in the Phaedrus, which is that beauty itself has a distinction from the beautiful displays, in particular in the world. The one goodness or beauty itself participates to create those particular beautiful things that we see in time and space. And so out of this, these little tidbits here of these dialogues, we can see that in the later Plato, we're noticing that there's really two distinctions, at least they appear to be, of cosmology and the moral order that we live in. However, with an education of the pre-Socratics, we actually see that this is going to have tremendous overlap, because of course, remember with the pre-Socratics, knowledge about nature and the good life then is going to play into how you see reality, how nature actually is, and what that means for you in your life. And this is, of course, a call to understanding how the pre-Socratics would discuss rationality and the logos. Think of things like the logos nous. And so by virtue of the one, the form of all forms, there has to be a sort of order and rationality, a logos to the cosmos. So the form of the goodness is to be good. We are then to be likewise good morally. And so again, we're seeing that demonstration here of the macrocosm of the cosmos and the micro being of your own individual life and your path towards goodness, and what that means also for the city around you, for your community, and that three scheme relationship really of the cosmos, the city, and the individual once again. So both of these distinctions, though, are ultimately given to us by the source of that moral goodness. So while they do appear on the surface to be two different topics, they actually overlap, which is, of course, common with Plato's philosophy. There's an interwovenness with all of these works together. And so when we turn to the Timaeus, we see the discussion really of the artificer. And now we're really going to sink into that cosmological picture here of how this really all works. And now we also have to talk about the concept of the world soul, as you would see in the likes of the laws, and it's even brought up in the Sophists, of course, because they don't care much for goodness. Now, for the artificer, we're really discussing a worker, a craftsman, as Plato would discuss. He is the one who creates art. And so he is a sort of cosmic workman, a craftsman who, since he is, of course, being good in himself, the artificer will want the good, thus creating the eternal forms, the eternal goodness. However, for Plato, and I think this is important to get back to our overarching discussion that we've been having on the channel for many months now, Plato refers to this as a likely story. And this is very interesting, I think, because Plato, of course, we're just talking about dialectics and, following arguments and applying that sort of logic to things through, of course, the character Socrates, through his dialectic method. In this case, he calls it a likely story. So, for the most part, we see clear concepts and, literal statements being put to scrutiny. But in this case, we cannot have a full, clear picture, or be able to have a sort of clear, literal concept. And so he personifies it perhaps not as a sort of personal deity, but he uses it as a sort of language as his best example. Since he cannot, rationally go about this, he is going to ultimately use the methodology of language as through his statements of what he thinks God really is. Now this turns us to, as we've discussed on the channel, with the likes of Gene Gebser and other thinkers of that sort, with the mythic structure and the push towards the rational structure. And of course, as mentioned many times before, it's not like just this overnight thing or an entire civilization goes from one conscious structure, one way of thinking, one way of being, to another one overnight, and it's just this mass transformation. Of course, there's handovers, there's sort of taking back. It's not just this cut and dry black and white fixture here, but one that's rather quite dynamic in my opinion. And we see here that he uses the terminology, the language of myth here, but it doesn't really seem to that is one of sincere belief, if you will, even though everything else discussed really comes under that rationalist structure. Here he quite explicitly invokes a likely story, and I think that's interesting to point out as an aside for again, measuring that passing of the mythic structure to the rationalist one through the Greeks here, and especially with Plato. Now, the demiurge is considered good. The artificer is to be the source of the being of those forms. Why wouldn't this also be the source of the being of the cosmos? Being good, he desired all to be good, and made so according to the form or the ideas, the grand plan, if you will, the blueprint that the artificer is creating out of this world as a sort of architect. And so he assigns to that world soul the cosmos as a living creature for the world soul to inhabit. So for not just Plato but the Greeks, the world is alive. It's something that's developing and moving, and has its own sort of relationship with the supreme being that pushes it on. So morally, in the individual, we see this as seeing the body and the soul, and how each of us have our own relationship with body and soul. There is also a cosmological picture here of soul being associated with things like life, but also one of divinities or the gods, and that lived body of the grand universe then is another kind of picture of that microcosm. We all have bodies, we all have souls, and we have particular relationships of our body and souls. Same with the divinity and the cosmological picture of the universe body and that world soul and the artificer. Now, of course, moving ahead through the centuries, the implications of such a theory is going to really be one of the romantic, and all of the romantic movements, especially recently, if you will, with regards to the 19th century, who the romanticists once again revived up Plato to come up with things like developmental psychology and theories of history, of course, where the world has its own vitality. It's not inert like the empiricists might have seen earlier. It is one that is ongoing and developing through history. But let's discuss this world soul now. It is a sort of active power that shapes in accordance to the forms given. The artificer gives to that world soul the sort of mold, if you will, of how the world soul will participate and activates it to take action into a coordinates to what that given form is. So then we turn to us as individuals. Our souls should move in that same coordinates to the good, to the forms, just as the world soul moves towards the cosmic good order. Now, I want to turn then to the theaetetus, which is, of course, the turning to the question of our moral life and the good life, and really his conception of what evil is then can be fleshed out here. Evil, for Plato, can never be done away with because the good must always have its polarity, its contrary. Now remember, we discussed how, Plato saw something wrong with the world as we live in time and space, because of course he's, wanting to guide us towards the good, the eternal, the forms. So there is a sort of antagonism then to time and space, reality, if you will. And for Plato's picture here of evil, he sees that there has to be something that's driving why we aren't able to just have a 1-to-1 ratio of the eternal forms and this world. And that relationship of polarity, it's similar to, of course, light and dark, hot and cold. The good has a necessity for evil. Now, of course, this isn't the case in the divine world. Evil has no place in the eternal, where goodness truly is. So evil has to haunt down in the human world, where evil is necessary, while it is not so in the eternal world. Justice, then, and to be good, is to be like in that vision of goodness, of the eternal world. This is the good that we seek in this world, and to do so is to not give in to the wicked. Now, of course, in his particular time, when addressing the likes of sophists and the use of rhetoric, there is a lot of false good in the world. There's a lot of push towards that wickedness, and so in the world of appearances, one can appear to be good, but in reality, it is self-interest. It is just them looking out for themselves. If there does happen to be somewhat of an overlap with goodness, it's not because it's guided towards the vision of the gods to be godlike. It is simply happenstance, or it isn't really the ends so much. It's more about the means and achieving victory in this world of appearances. The divine then has no shadow. It's only perfection of being, truly righteous. And so this is a hard sell, of course, for because this implies then for Plato that you might not necessarily get what you want out of this world because you happen to be good. Because if it was truly righteous, if it was truly for the eternal, and of course the main character for Plato and all of his writings, in this case Socrates, he who was orientated towards the good, suffered greatly, suffered immense, and ultimately paid the greatest toll of them all. So we have this discussion really of the shadow and being unrighteous, and by being orientated towards being godlike, being towards the good, then we see the shadows veer away to really understand where one's relationship is towards power and soul, really. And so the form of the good has the model or the ideal for that moral life we wish to live. In the statesman in particular, where God is sort of participant as a sort of shepherd, and this relationship then translates down to our human life, where the statesman acts as a sort of shepherd of his people, and in doing so, where God acts as a sort of shepherd, the statesman, plays right along into that cosmological scheme of Plato. Just as there is the God who shepherds us, there also needs to be the authority through our political life that shepherds us as a people towards the good. So in the laws, God is spoke of the self, moving world soul, as if he had moved really away from the artificer and the world soul, and he's kind of weaved them all at this point into one being, instead of having two distinctions that we discussed with them both. He sort of weaves them into one here, interesting enough. So self-moving and all-knowing, and cares for the affairs of others, because of course he's a shepherd, so he wants to give direction to us, rewarding good and evil. And again, this is another interesting play into how, when we discuss the likes of the early Homerics that Plato wants to reform, we see very much so careless gods in the regards to human affairs. They whatever happened to the humans in their own ends, in their own cosmological picture, paid no heed. Where Plato, it's explicitly a relationship between us and the divine here. It's an interaction, because we need to be shepherded, to demonstrate the point of how Plato's cosmology and morality towards the good life overlap in such a profound way that in Timaeus we see a discussion of cosmology, at least on the surface, but it is ultimately a dialogue about the moral life and the state of the soul. And he works in how the cosmal order overseen by the god through the activity of the world soul. The cosmology then is a means to the ends of talking about moral life. Evil, on the other hand, so in this case the good, harmony, justice, these concepts of the moral life, whereas evil, on the other hand, is disharmony. And so how do we account for both good and evil in a cosmic sense? And in the Timaeus, we see the good versus evil as the reason of the world's soul, or necessity, or the Greek term anagonke. And so these two polarities, you have the causal necessity of blind force of evil in that sense, or something like a deterministic fate that operates in nature in addition to that of goodness. And then with the scheme of non-being, you have that coupled together with the primal material. It's disharmony. It's wanting to do its own thing. And eternal matter then cannot be completely controlled against the reason, the goodness of the eternal soul. Matter then is resistant, or at least the concept that Plato discusses with that sort of ambiguity towards how we consider non-being as a sort of primordial material condition. It's resistant, and it is analogy to the body subject to that forces we can't control. Of course, we have adverse effects with our body where it does things, it ages, and we can't control that. We can't just choose to not sneeze, if you will, when we really need to. And so there's impulses, there's things that go beyond just reason and goodness that's out there. So Plato's interpretations after were, of course, more monistic, having one reality where matter is non-being or nothing, and then we have forms trying through the particulars to manifest itself in the world of different conflicting particulars. This offers up that idealistic interpretation, as opposed to what you might see with a dualistic one. This interplay of these opposing qualities in the physical world. And we saw with the pre-Socratics going back, the elements and their oppositions. This is the case with Anaximander, for example, who found, wetness, but also dry, hot, and cold. And so there wasn't this acknowledgement of this ultimate or this undefined something. No element was above the other, so there was no need to, privilege one of these elements. And so Plato says that two opposing properties make up the physical world. And with that, the God himself, he assists that world as it's parting through his rotation, through his shepherding, if you will. But in other eras, he would release that control, and things turn to becoming, really, or could be implied a sort of fallenness from the ideal that the divine had parted onto the world to then be released. And so turning to the laws, Plato talks about the dyad, and he has a dualistic, really, direction. And so in addition to the one or the world soul, the dyad is a sort of second something, or what could be implied as natural forces that are at play that move away from the direction that the world soul is going. And then in the statesman, there is a sort of resistance to being kept in your rational place. The nature of the bodily is not ever in a sort of staying and unchanging. And with that, how we are put in place, the heavens or the universe receive many gifts or forms who are brought into it, being, but thus making it impossible to stay in place without turning towards becoming, towards a sort of fallenness from the great gift of being aptly in place at a given time. But Plato also rejects the dualism notion that two divines could take up one being, the architect of our being, to that of becoming or necessity. In one of the eras or time periods of God's interaction or shepherding, an assistance from the divine. In other eras, innate forces take over, and momentum revolves in sort of reversal of what that divine assistance had implied. And so God's acts then set in its order all the virtues it contains, but that chaotic primal condition is where all wrong and evil really arises from. And so when it's guided by the divine, it pilots, but travels along and sort of has a sort of stage of forgetting in a different era where the material forces take over, and they forget this gift, they forget this act of God, and the parallel is reverting back from that goodness through forgetting. And so then the God, of course, turns to this reversion and sees that once again we must be shepherded, and so he takes control of the helm once more to re-guide the cosmological picture towards goodness. And so we see a sort of cyclical view here, or a cycle of a cosmological order, a rational harmony, the logo nous, if you will, to that of evil, of growing disharmony. And the pre-Socratics, and I think it was Gebser who talked about this a lot, where the Greeks had this notion through the harvest, and so they had this sort of cyclical view of history, and how it would cycle and go through different conditions. You also can pick up on that intellectually with the pre-Socratics, where the elements go from integration to disintegration, And we see this echo here with Plato's alternative governments, where you have different cycles a society moves from. And so we inherit this instability through our finite existence because, of course, we live in the world of becoming and change. And so evil out of that is a natural ingredient for the natural order in a finite world in this case, not one of the divine or the eternal. The problem of natural evil is the problem of the nature of being a finite being rather than a sort of moral stance. And so when you understand this, perhaps you really understand the attitudes that the likes of Socrates has. He was never, vengeful towards ignorance, towards particular cases of ignorance with individuals, and he acted, gracefully with that sort of mindset. Because ultimately, in the Platonic view, we see that evil has a sort of natural element to it that comes with us with the burden of being a finite being rather than a question of moral conundrum. And so that's really how you overlap the picture of the cosmological way that Plato sees the world and sees our relationship with the divine, and also our relationship in our own personal lives, in the articulation of a beautiful soul within us, and how that plays into politics and living the good life, as it were. And so with that, I think I've parsed through some of these dialogues in a bite-sized, or trying to keep it as bite-sized as possible way, and show the interplay here in this discussion of cosmology and the moral life. And I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you for the next one.